There's a kind of silence that doesn't echo. Not the silence of serenity, but the silence that stings. It's the pause that comes after connection, the stillness after warmth. When a man chooses to retreat into silence, it's not absence, it's avoidance. It's a message written in disappearing ink. Hi, I'm Vernon again. Today we're going to explore something quietly painful, yet deeply important. The 6 greatest weaknesses of a man who ignores you. This is not just about behavior, it's about the emotional immaturity, the psychological patterns, and the fear that drive it. Because being ignored isn't always a reflection of your worth, but more often a mirror of his inner struggle. That quiet pulling away, it leaves more than silence. It leaves doubt. But behind that silence often hides fear, not strength. 6 weaknesses most men never name. If you've ever asked, "Why is he ignoring me?" stay with me. This is wisdom, not guesswork. And by the end, you may see him more clearly, and yourself too. If this speaks to you, don't hesitate to like this video, share it with someone who needs it, and subscribe for more reflections like this. It helps more than you know. Let's gently open the door to the first truth, a quiet knowing that many women carry deep inside, though few men ever put into words. 1. He lacks the emotional maturity to face intimacy. A man who ignores rather than communicates is often not cruel, but unready. Not for love itself, but for what love demands: presence, vulnerability, and emotional truth. Emotional immaturity doesn't always show in tantrums or rash decisions. It often looks quiet, controlled, even accomplished. But when the moment calls for depth, for uncomfortable honesty, for emotional staying power, he fades. Why? Because closeness isn't just about affection, it's about being seen. And for a man who hasn't matured emotionally, being seen feels like being exposed. Many men grow up being told to stay strong, not soft, to be providers, not partners. They learned to respond, but not to reflect, to solve, but not to sit with pain. This kind of man may desire connection, but lacks the emotional language to sustain it. So when he ignores you, he may not be punishing you. He may simply be overwhelmed by the emotional terrain, like a traveler lost in a country where he doesn't speak the language. As Carl Jung once said, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. A man who ignores you may not be acting from intention, but from blind patterns, old wounds, unspoken fears, and the belief that silence keeps him safe. But silence is not safety. It is avoidance dressed as strength. The invitation here isn't to chase him, but to recognize the difference between someone silent because they're reflecting and someone silent because they're escaping. And in that recognition, we begin to reclaim our own center. And yet, emotional immaturity is only the beginning. There's another weakness, often tied closely to the first, that runs even deeper.
2. He uses emotional detachment as a shield. There's a moment in every long relationship where silence isn't empty, it's full of things left unsaid. I remember one such moment with my wife, not during an argument, but in one of those quiet pauses that stay with you. She looked at me and said, "You're here, Vernon, but I can't feel you. We'd been married for decades. I was present, in the room, in the routines, in the doing of things, but not in the feeling of them, not in the us of it. You see, I thought being steady was enough, that showing up meant I was connected. But over time, I realized I had built quiet walls around the parts of me that felt too tender to share. Not because I didn't care, but because I didn't know how to open them. Some men don't disappear physically, they detach emotionally. They become good at looking involved while staying unreachable. And it's not always malicious. Often it's learned. It's protective. Vulnerability feels like danger. Connection feels like exposure. The Stoic philosopher Epictetus once said, "It's not what happens to you, but how you react to it that matters." But when a man uses detachment to avoid reaction, to avoid responsibility, to avoid intimacy, he stops growing. He becomes a mirror with no reflection. You speak, and nothing comes back. If you've been on the receiving end of that silence, not the silence of peace, but the silence of someone shutting the door, you are not imagining it. And it's not your job to pry that door open. In fact, one of the most powerful things you can do is honor your own voice in the face of his absence. And if this part of the message resonates with you, a like on this video lets me know it's reaching who it needs. Still, not every man who detaches is doing it to protect himself from you. Some detach because they believe it makes them stronger, that suppressing emotion is a sign of control. And that brings us to a deeper weakness, one shaped not by fear, but by pride.
3. He mistakes control for strength. Have you ever felt like you were being tested in silence, like your pain was being observed but never acknowledged? That he saw your hurt but chose restraint over response? Some men wear control like armor. They think that to feel deeply is to fall apart, and so they tighten, not just their schedule or their tone, but their soul. They become composed, unshaken, and utterly closed. To them, strength means staying untouched. But true strength is not the stillness of stone. It is the flexibility of a tree in the wind. It's not the clenched jaw, but the open hand. In relationships, control often disguises itself as leadership. But leadership that silences dialogue is not strength, it's dominance. A man who insists on controlling the terms of connection is like a conductor who won't let the orchestra play. Every note becomes his, and the music loses its soul. He builds a kingdom where he rules alone, not realizing that love is not a subject to govern, but a rhythm to join. In that lonely echo chamber, love doesn't just weaken, it suffocates. The philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche once wrote, "He who cannot put his thoughts on ice should not enter into the heat of dispute." And yet some men live permanently on ice, not from wisdom, but from fear. The fear that if they let go, even slightly, they'll drown in everything they've held back. When you speak your truth, and he responds with silence, or logic, or distance, it's not always that he doesn't care. Sometimes it's that he's afraid to lose control. Because control is what he's confused for safety. But safety built on suppression isn't safety at all. It's a fortress that eventually becomes a prison for both of you. Still, not all control stems from pride. Sometimes it's woven into a man's identity long before he knows who he really is, passed down from fathers who measured love by achievement, not affection. In those homes, silence was discipline, and softness was shame. Over time, that inheritance becomes invisible armor. And that leads us into another weakness, one that runs deeper than one man's fear. It's a legacy, a pattern, a story retold from father to son without ever being questioned.
4. He carries the weight of unspoken generations. Some wounds are not ours, but we live with them anyway. Many men were raised in silence, not just the absence of noise, but the absence of nurturing. In those homes, emotions were luxuries, affection was rationed, and softness was a sign of weakness. A boy growing up in that world doesn't just learn to be tough, he learns that being tender is dangerous. And so he inherits the emotional debts of his father and his father before him, men who knew how to endure, but not how to express. Men who built homes from bricks and sacrifice, but never learned how to open the door of their own inner world. They handed down blueprints for survival, but left behind no map for emotional belonging. So he becomes a man who knows how to work, to provide, to hold things together, but not how to let himself be held. And in that quiet, inherited struggle, love becomes a language he recognizes, but cannot speak fluently. I've seen it in men who flinch when asked, "How do you feel?" or who freeze when someone cries in front of them, not out of cruelty, but confusion. They were never given the language of intimacy, only the grammar of grit. It's like trying to paint with only the colors of gray. They want to love, but they were never shown what love looks like when it's soft, expressive, and whole. As the philosopher Alain de Botton puts it, we are not merely the authors of our lives, but the editors of unfinished stories handed to us. And sometimes those stories begin with silence. If this part speaks to something you've seen in a partner, a friend, or even your own father, tell me in comment that what have you noticed about what gets passed down quietly and unquestioned. But not every weakness is quiet. Some aren't shaped by silence or passed down from fathers. They come from a hunger, a longing buried so deep even he doesn't recognize it. Some weaknesses don't hide, they ache. And what a man cannot say often reveals more than what he does.
5. He craves emotional validation, but doesn't know how to ask for it. A 2022 study in the Journal of Social and Personal Relationships revealed something quietly staggering. A significant number of men reported deep emotional loneliness, not when they were alone, but while in long-term relationships. The tragedy here is most of them never said a word about it, not because they didn't feel it, but because they didn't think they could. Because somewhere along the way, many men were taught that needing emotional closeness was a kind of weakness, a private ache that should stay hidden behind strength, logic, or silence. This is one of the most misunderstood weaknesses in male psychology, The hunger for emotional validation, the deep desire to feel seen, heard, and valued beyond roles or performance is something many men feel but silently suppress. He may not say, "I need to feel appreciated." Instead, he waits for it to show up in gestures, in tone, in subtle affirmations, and when it doesn't come the way he imagined, he feels invisible, but says nothing. He pulls away, not out of punishment, but out of quiet despair. It's a kind of drought inside the heart, not from lack of love, but from the inability to ask for rain. And this is where the paradox lies. The man who ignores you may actually be the one most desperate to be acknowledged, but has never learned how to make that need known without feeling weak. We often speak of women's emotional labor, but we rarely talk about men's emotional hunger. When ignored or unmet, it festers, sometimes turning into withdrawal, sometimes into anger, but often into silence. If you've ever sensed that someone was waiting for you to just know what they needed, but never found the words, you're not alone. And I'd love to hear in the comments, what happens when needs go unspoken in a relationship? Still, emotional hunger doesn't always stem from what a man lacks. Sometimes it's fueled by something far more subtle, a fear that if he lets you too close, you'll see the very thing he's worked so hard to hide. Because for some men, the deepest fear isn't being alone, it's being known. And when closeness threatens to expose the self they've kept hidden, they don't lean in, they vanish. And that leads us to a final weakness, one that doesn't shout or explain, but simply disappears. It's not the loudest pain, but often the most isolating. 6. He fears being truly seen. The closer you get to some men, the more they fade. It's not because they don't care, it's because they fear being revealed. For them, intimacy isn't comfort, it's exposure. And exposure means risk of being judged, misunderstood, or worst of all, not enough. This kind of man has likely spent years shaping a version of himself built for endurance, strong, capable, composed. But beneath that polished exterior is not peace, but pressure. The version he shows the world isn't who he is, but who he believes he has to be. And when someone gets too close, when love begins to shine a light on the soft, uncertain, unguarded parts of him, he doesn't meet that light. He retreats from it. Not in anger, not in noise, but in stillness. In the quiet withdrawal of someone who fears that being seen will lead to being rejected. He unravels not in public, but inside, silently. Because to be seen is to risk being known. And for him, being known feels far more dangerous than being alone. To be seen is to be known. And to be known is to risk not being loved. That's the belief many men carry deep in their bones. So instead of leaning in, they disappear. Instead of softening, they go silent. Not because you saw too little, but because you saw too much. What they don't realize is that love, real love, only begins when the mask comes off. That vulnerability is not the end of connection, it's the beginning. So if you've ever felt someone pull away the moment you reached their heart, know this: it's not about your worth. It's about their fear,
And if this reflection feels familiar, save this video. You may want to come back to it on a day when the silence feels heavier than usual.
Now, take a quiet moment with what you've just heard. Let it sit. Let it speak to you in its own time. Because what we've uncovered here isn't just about the men who ignore. It's about the quiet wars they're fighting within, the burdens they carry in silence, the fear that love will unmask them. These 6 weaknesses are not just character flaws. They are echoes of unspoken lessons, inherited beliefs, and emotional debts no one taught them how to repay. To be strong without becoming hard, to be soft without losing dignity, to let someone close without fearing the collapse of self. These are the inner battles so many men never name, and yet they shape how love is given or withheld. Understanding these truths does not excuse the pain, but it does give us language. It gives us clarity, and from clarity we gain choice in how we respond, how we protect our peace, and how we love with boundaries and compassion. As the philosopher Marcus Aurelius once wrote, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." May this clarity become your strength. May it help you love wisely, leave gently when you must, and never again mistake silence for your fault. As the philosopher Søren Kierkegaard once said, "Life can only be understood backwards, but it must be lived forwards." Perhaps in understanding these silences, we can live forward with more compassion, more clarity, and more courage. If this video gave you something to think about, something to feel, or simply something to hold on to, consider subscribing. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. And most of all, stay with yourself. Stay with your wisdom. So if you're carrying silence from someone you once trusted, let this be your reminder. It's not your fault, and you are not alone. And I'm Vernon. Thanks for watching my video.